Today's guest is Eric Uhlmann, professor at INSEAD Business School. He's going to talk to us a little bit more about the IIT and its relation to discriminatory behavior. But first, when I start these videos, I like to just zoom out a little bit and ask researchers what are the questions that most guide their work.
Sure. Well, pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me. So I think for me, what's guided my research most over the last 12 years or so is to what extent do our subjective choices affect our research? That can either be in how a study is designed or how it's statistically analyzed. So um, kind of for the last decade or more, actually, I've been kind of taking more of a meta-scientific view of trying to shine the lens of science on science, and then, better understand how our subjective decisions that we make, whether in good faith or not, how those can affect our findings. In addition, I mean, related to that, how can we try to reduce such subjectivity as much as we can, knowing that we can never be perfectly objective, and such a thing may not even exist, or even if it does, is very hard to approach in practice. And
Okay.
therefore, how can we improve our science and remove subjectivity as much as we can? So it's very much from a kind of post-positivist kind of perspective that there is some sort of real stuff out there, but we view it through this fog of our own kind of subjective lenses. And it's very hard to get rid of that. It's hard to get rid of subjectivity from science, but it's good to at least reduce it.
So that leads very nicely into my next question because in class we went over how this paper is notable for several aspects, but one of them being the use of adversarial collaboration. You're kind of more the expert in adversarial collaboration than I am. So at least I'll let you say a little bit about why you thought adversarial collaboration was so useful here, and what do you think its main benefits are more broadly?
So here, I certainly wouldn't call myself an expert in adversarial collaboration, but I think it's great. I mean, I think it's something that really helps avoid directional bias in how research questions are framed, studies are designed, the statistical analysis, and then also how the results are interpreted, right? So in a group of folks who are either like-minded intellectually, so we're all committed to the same set of ideas, and or like-minded politically, we have a certain kind of view of the world on a politically charged issue, which the study is relevant to. There's a real risk that lack of diversity on that dimension could lead to a lot of bias that even much of which could actually be unconscious. So the adversarial collaboration approach tries to address that by having someone else who's equally biased but in the opposite direction. So you pose the research question, design the study, decide the statistical analysis, and how you're going to interpret it as well together, jointly,
Mhm.
so that you both agree the study is a diagnostic test of your respective predictions, um, and are a little bit more locked in. Because what I think often happens in a more small science or traditional science approach, where individual labs do projects and debate things with other labs, is it's very lawyerly, right? So we publish our paper that we invested a huge amount of effort in, and thanks Jordan, for leading the IT adversarial collaboration. We all invest a lot of work, especially Jordan in this case. And then you publish it, and it's very hard not to be a lawyer then defending your work, right? And when something that somebody else publishes is critical to or presents evidence that seems to go against claims you have made, well, there's a real tendency to fall into a lot of post hoc motivated reasoning where you're trying to dismiss a design that you might have been fine with had you been a part of it, or that with minor changes might have actually been highly diagnostic, right? And so I think that when you're doing these things beforehand, it stimulates critical thinking and reflection on all sides. And then it avoids kind of being locked in professionally or having a perverse professional incentive to dismiss evidence if it comes out in a contrary way. So I think it's brilliant in principle, I think it's for me, it's been fabulous in practice. I have heard of a few adversarial collaborations that dissolved due to a lot of, basically got overly acrimonious. And then it went sour. But that hasn't happened to me so far. I've only had good experiences, especially when I was right. But even when I was wrong, or mostly wrong, I found it to be a really great experience. This particular paper, my experience of it was very collegial and harmonious. There were some differences of opinion on things, but nothing spilled over, from the task disagreement. How are we going to design this study to I hate you kind of
Yes, that's true. I can
relationship
sure.
conflict as opposed to task conflict, as we would say in OB.
Yeah.
Um,
So I like that framing about how when there's an adversarial collaboration, your biases are kind of canceling each other out, but you're also keeping an eye on the other ones, the intentional or not, the assumptions that a person is making that kind of feed into their design and their choices. Thinking,
yeah, sure, sure. Yeah, so sorry to interject.
no,
I
sure,
would just say I would frame it as kind of more the biases counterbalance each
under
other as opposed
balance.
to each other,
Fair
because we
point.
have no truly objective person in the group, and there probably isn't such a person.
True.
So it's more that they provide a foil or balance for each other. Sorry to interject.
No problem. So thinking about the results of the studies more specifically, the IAT, the concept of implicit bias, has been around for 30 years. We've been fighting about it in some way or arguing about it in some way for 30 years. And this, I think it's fair to say, is the first time that proponents and skeptics of these measures have really worked together to produce an empirical study. So for someone who's maybe not so familiar with the ins and outs of these past 3 decades, but is at least reading this paper, what do you hope that they most take away from it?
So here, I guess, for me, good takeaways are implicit measures, which have been much maligned. As you know, Jordan, there was an incredible enthusiasm. I started out as a young nerdling in Tony Greenwald's lab, the lab the IET came from, in the late 1990s. And I shared an office with Brian Nosek, who created the Project Implicit website. And it just completely blew up and became a rare example of academic research that actually became part of popular culture, where a lot of people just in a classroom walking in, they've already taken the IAT, or people at dinner have heard about it. And it's really been kind of a flagship kind of method for the implicit bias research program. Um, in more recent years, I think especially with the credibility revolution in the behavioral sciences, there's been a lot of criticism to the effect that the validity is not as good as people claim, and some of these initial enthusiastic claims were maybe, whether by the scientists or by the press, were maybe a little bit overly optimistic about what this approach had to contribute. So there was an implicit bias revolution, if you will, and then kind of a little bit of a counter revolution. Um, to the point that I think, at least among a lot of people, implicit measures are pretty dismissed, or at least that's been my experience. So, kind of in the context of that, I think that our paper shows that implicit measures do have real utility under extremely rigorous conditions. Um, to a greater extent than explicitly predicted by the skeptics who were in the adversarial collaboration. And here we have very eminent skeptics: Phil Tetlock, Greg Mitchell, Corey Clark. The IAT predicted more variance than the specific numeric amount of variance they thought it would, as well as what they considered negligible. So it did better than the critics expected, and very importantly, showed utility above and beyond explicit self-report measures. So it does give you something that the self-report measure does not. On the other hand, and kind of in favor of the kind of more skeptical view, explicit self-report measures were dramatically more uh, more capable at predicting the outcomes, which is very much against what a lot of the early rhetoric about implicit bias, which was just contrarily dismissive of the explicit measures and saying those are useless or low in utility, and we need people lie
Mhm.
and don't know what they think actually, and we need to switch to these implicit measures. So it's kind of a nice. I think another bit that So the takeaway would be implicit measures have real value, and they have value above and beyond explicit self-reports, but they can by no means supplant them. And if you have to choose one, the explicit self-report measure, at least now, is stronger. And it's important to emphasize there, though, that you don't want to equate the method and the underlying construct. It could be that implicit attitudes are actually extremely powerful, but the implicit measures like the IET and evaluative priming and the AMP are just not that good at capturing it, right? But for what it's worth, the current state of the knowledge is, or our paper suggests, is implicit measures have some validity, but also have substantial limits. That would be my takeaway.
Yeah, so I think that that's really well put. You can really see people from both sides having to update their beliefs a little bit in light of these results.
Right.
Are these implicit measures like the IIT bunk, are they useless? No, we're still seeing evidence that they can be predictive, but relative to what is predicted by explicit self-report, maybe we have to tone down our enthusiasm a little bit there.
Yeah, and I think the project that that you've led for us really is a beautiful example of adversarial collaboration in that both sides have to move a little bit more
Yep,
towards the
exactly.
moderate center relative to things that we've all said in print and committed to. So I think that's quite nice because there's other adversarial collaborations that are a smashing victory for one side and not
Yeah,
the other.
true.
But this was a very balanced. The very balanced. The data were very Confucian in that sense.
Yes, I guess so. So you said something in that in your last answer. You said, quote, you tested this under rigorous conditions, or at least in very controlled laboratory conditions. So maybe that's a clue to where you're going with this next question of mine. But this larger research project, this by no means closes the door on studying the IIT and its relation to behavior. So is there a next step in this larger research question you really want to tackle in the years to come?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's two that I've proposed to the group, including you. So one is I think to take it into field settings. So when I said rigorous, I meant more a controlled laboratory study with large samples, highly reliable measures, and pre-commitment to statistical analysis. Now, I didn't. There's another kind of rigor, which would be show that this actually matters in real world settings.
Hmm.
So I think that's the next step would be to try to do a pared down version of the study in a field setting, right? So, for example, with a corporate partner or partners, measure the implicit attitudes of managers who have racially diverse people that they're supervising, and then look at their decisions about those people, whether it's compensation or promotion, etc. I think the dream kind of study, which might be a pipe dream, but would be to have a whole bunch of different companies and then look at moderators like their HR practices, right? So, for example, more structured HR practices um, might lead, salary bands and
Okay.
rules and regulations might reduce implicit bias on things like compensation, but it would probably still be there for things like promotions, for example.
Hmm.
So we could also look at what things might constrain bias. That's less likely, but I think the key thing is just do these measures predict the decisions of actual people about actual other people in naturalistic field settings, right? And so that's a more noisy, less controlled setting, but a much more relevant one. A second frontier, I think, is some of the strongest evidence for the utility of implicit measures comes from the bias of the crowds research program, right? Which, as you know, rather than looking at individual level prediction, looks at it at the level of aggregates. So, zip codes, for example, or states even. And what the program shows is that if you aggregate across, say, a zip code, you can use that to predict interesting outcomes. So, for example, implicit racial bias is stronger in um, parts of the United States that used to have slavery, right? So that would be an antecedent condition. But then it actually predicts things like police shootings in that zip code in contemporary times. So I think it would be, and this is this whole program of research. So I think it would be useful to do an adversarial collaboration between proponents and skeptics, where we outline in advance and maybe also do a survey of experts, what are likely antecedents of implicit bias, what are theoretical outcomes, capture them all rigorously, right, and try to try to kind of estimate them without a kind of publication bias, et cetera. I think another key question is to what extent, I think it will, but to what extent do the implicit measures predict above and beyond explicit self-report, which is often left out of these papers. So a lot of these papers will report these really cool findings that, slavery and police shootings are related to zip code level implicit bias. But they, at least some of the ones I've seen, don't report, does it predict it any better than just asking people on a survey?
Yeah, I agree with
Um,
that.
uh, and another one is also, now that the Project Implicit website, which Brian created, in our basement at Hill House Avenue back at Yale, quarter century or more ago. So many people have taken this test over so many years now. It's been a quarter century that we might be able to use the longitudinal data to start to get an initial sense of causality, right? So, does implicit bias in 2005 predict police shootings in 2025? Or is it that police shootings in 2005 better
Mm,
predict implicit bias in 2025? Now, if the latter is the case, it might be that these bias of the crowds effects show implicit associations reflecting the society as opposed to highlighting a causal contributor
right.
to the observed outcome. So I think these issues of false positives, which I'm less worried about, but it's worth looking at, incremental validity above self-report measures, um,
Time sequence. Cosmology.
and then yeah, temporal sequence are would be super interesting to look at. But those are the two big fronts to me:
Yeah.
field studies in organizations with individual level prediction, and then more field data, but with aggregate level prediction. I think that's
Yeah.
super interesting to follow up on.
It's very clear. Yeah, those are very important next directions. I mean, just to kind of tie it into a little bit of class content, I think what you said for the first front on the field studies was interesting because, ideally you could find an organization with maybe less regulated decision-making environments and show strong prediction of the IAT for some selection outcomes like hiring. And then compare that with ideally a similar organization, but has more constrained policies like salary bands, like you were talking about, or more systematic ways of evaluating people in their show that the IT does not predict people's behavior because we talk
Yeah.
one of the strengths of some of these organizational practices is in limiting the ability for these biases to impact our behavior. So you're
That's
right.
right, right. Although there's limits to kind of imposing those limits, right? So there are some jobs where individual performance is easy to measure. So sales, for example, I have a buddy who quintupled sales in Asia Pacific, so that kind of speaks for itself and insulates him from some organizational politics, objective top
Mm,
performance, right? But there's others where you're working in a team and it's kind of really hard to say who did what, right?
mm,
Or the so you might be doing a great job, but there's ambiguity. So there also could be differences across these different sorts of are you a fire inspector? Or are you working on a fire stopping team, right? That's it's different in measuring performance, in
it's true.
capturing bias, and then also in trying to control for it.
Yeah, it's never so clear cut about what an objective indicator is. There's a lot of kind of individual subjectivity that can go into those indices. But if there's a viewer who works with an organization who's chomping at the bit to help us run this study, please circle back to us either
Yeah,
now or
please,
years from
please.
now.
So
We'll be happy to
what we're really looking for there is corporate partners who are willing to take the plunge. Let us have their managers take these some just a few implicit measures, not as many as in the paper, a lot less, whatever works for you, and then also is willing to open up kind of these HR records, which of course we would keep totally
Yes,
confidential.
so we can call that the white whale at this moment. But when
That's
that
right. Yeah,
happens,
well.
which it will, I'm an optimist. You will come back and you'll tell us all about the results of that study.
Or
But I just
hopefully I'll
want
come
to
back to you to lead the project.
Okay. Okay. But I
Thank
really
you.
thank you for your time here, Eric, and I appreciate your insights on the project.